It's 9 o'clock. Welcome to day 2 of the ESS Biennial conference in wonderful Dublin. I am Bob Picciotto. I am on the board of the European Evaluation Society, EES. EES is your society, and it's an open society. We look south, ideas. We look east, the new member states. We look west to the Americas, Latin America, and also North America. And let's not forget Australia and New Zealand. Australia is where our speaker originates. I will be brief. Michael Scriven needs no introduction in the evaluation world. He was there at the creation. If evaluation is a discipline today, or a transdiscipline, if it's built on sound foundations, if it's carried out in the public interest, if it's attracting new talent and young energies to the field, it's in significant part because of Michael's intellectual leadership, his unflagging commitment, and his capacity to inspire. We are proud and grateful that he accepted our invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts. Michael will once again shatter myths and blast into unexplored territory. His theme is the last frontier. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Scriven.
Well, greetings, dear friends and colleagues. May I begin by thanking some people without whom I would not be here. Bob Picciotto, who organized the occasion so well and energetically. Jane Davidson, who helped me in every possible way when I took a bad fall 2 days ago on the roadway outside. And and in particular, for more than 50 years, the great group of grandfathers of the discipline of evaluation who welcomed and tolerated a brash alien as he became intrigued with the attempt to form, through a collegial effort, something that would then support a new profession, namely evaluation itself. That included Bob Stake and Dan Stufflebeam and Ernie House and many others who have not survived quite so long. Well, all that has changed now. I'm an old brash alien, and I'm going to try to shake things up again one more time today. This is an important moment in the history of evaluation. It's for 3 reasons that seem worth mentioning before I begin serious talk. First, it's about 50 years since we formed the first professional association in evaluation. Second, it's the year before the year that we have nominated as the Year of Evaluation, 2015, which should be a good time for reflection about what we have achieved and failed to achieve so far. And third, it's the first year of operation of a new player in that domain of evaluation, the Faster Forward Fund, which I'll be talking about more in the meeting that follows this immediately, and maybe get in a word at the end of this. But basically, it's a small foundation with very limited resources, but a very narrow focus. The focus is on what we might call the meta-evaluation of evaluation. That is, looking at what evaluation is up to, how well it has achieved what it's tried to do, what it hasn't tried to do that it perhaps should have and might still be able to do, and in general give priority to the maverick suggestions. In my discussions with many Nobelers and some other distinguished people, I've always been asking them what they think is the weakness in the scientific enterprise as practiced and supported in the United States. And they have often discussed this amongst themselves. And my take away from those discussions has been that the failure has been very largely a failure to fund the long shots. The problem with the way that we do funding is that we are only able to get people on the review committees who are typically workers within the current paradigm, because they are cautious about what they're going to support, and they understand the current paradigm very well and are very expert within it. But they're nervous about the idea of supporting long shots because they're long shots, and they're very different from the current paradigm. But those are the ones we have to support, because even though the ratio of success amongst that group is very low, the payoff is very high. And we have been neglecting that group partly because of the feature of our selection procedure. And the Faster Forward Fund is an attempt to bypass that mistake and take the risks involved, and will fund more or less exclusively out-of-the-box proposals to go in new directions for evaluation. That's the first criterion for funding by the Faster Forward Fund. The second is that there be some serious prospect of very large payoff. It's not only that you have to have a crazy idea, but it also has to be a crazy idea for producing useful results. Third, it is a requirement that you discuss the implications for the bottom billion, that is, for the poor of the world. Although I define the poor of the world to include those who are discriminated against in many ways, not just financially, but of course primarily financially. So although you don't have to prove or make it likely that if successful, that will be a great breakthrough for the poor of the world, you will have to explain how you've arrived at that conclusion that you won't be useful to them, because I want to be sure that you try to think very hard about how you might be able to help them. So those are the three criteria. And so it's a niche-filling effort, and that's something which we will be trying to get your suggestions for in some of the further sessions ahead of us at this meeting. Now, so those are three reasons why I think that it's an important year for reconsideration and survey of possibilities for our future. I rewrote this entirely during the night, so it's in my bad handwriting. We have done and are still doing a great deal of good work in areas which have some influence on the future of our own profession, but also to some degree mankind, humankind. Most obviously in our case and in our recent years with gender discrimination. And in this year, when the theme of this meeting is equity, preservation, and furtherance, we are paying particular attention to this. This is very important work. It has been going on for many decades already and is not yet finished. It's essential that we do it. But I'm not here to congratulate ourselves on our achievements, but to suggest how we can and should do more. Here's an outline of my thinking about that issue. First point, equity is an ethical notion, and indeed one that's very close to the foundations of ethics itself, to the basic notions of justice and rights, and as the word implies, the fundamental notion of equality of rights and consideration. Second point, but it is a small part of what we need to be doing in the domain of ethics. And it is a relatively easy part because in one respect, it's non-controversial, not so difficult. And that respect is that the underlying presupposition is not debated. That is, nobody is going to stand up and say, well, I mean, actually, I take that back. There are a few people in Texas who do stand up and say these things. That we shouldn't try for equality of rights, that we shouldn't grant either women or people of different colors the same rights, and so on and so on. But amongst the more civilized part of the society, that's not questioned. And the problems in ethics that are part of our business include many where the solving of the problem in ethics is very hard, whereas it's not with respect to equity. It's not hard to solve the problem of how, ethically speaking, we should rate other people. The answer is we should rate them equitably, with justice and consideration for their prima facie equal rights. So the good news about the equity issue is that it rests on an indisputable, which doesn't mean undisputed, but indisputable moral sensitivity to the notion of ethicality. We have many other problems which we tend not to address within evaluation, which fall into three groupings, and I'm going to talk about each of these, each of them harder than the preceding ones to handle from the ethical analysis point of view. All of them involve immense difficulties in applying whatever you consider the solution to be. And as we all know, the first lesson you learn in the field, or from carefully reading the literature in evaluation, is that getting the answer right is always relatively easy. Getting the answer done is hard. And so when it comes to the day of reckoning, the evaluator comes through the door. The application problems are tremendously hard to A, locate, and B, document, and C, do something about on a substantial scale. So in what happens in the real world of evaluation when we come to things which are not based on a straightforward case like equity of moral agreement, we have done a little bit less well. By and large, we use two strategies to deal with situations where we get plunged into a tough ethical problem by doing what we should be doing, a thorough discussion of the implications of the intervention that we're evaluating. What we should be doing, of course, is to find out all of the causal consequences of the intervention and assessing their merits and demerits. And all means all. That's something we are weak on, the side effects problem. It is not the case that in every single accepted by client or accepted by supervisor designed for an evaluation, there is a specific explicit section on how you are going to pick up the side effects. You must do that. It must be done. It must be in the rules of the game. We don't say it that, we don't teach it like that, and that's a very serious weakness. When you start dealing with drugs, like the FDA does, when the drug comes through the door to be approved, they hardly bother. That's a slight exaggeration, but they spend a very limited amount of routine time checking whether something that's supposed to be a painkiller does in fact produce some analgesic effects, some reduction of pain. They expect that at least that'll be true. The problem is, what else does it do? Who's it killing on the side in return for producing a headache reduction in pain? And so they understand the significance of side effects, but we've never really got a grip on that. Michael Bamberger was talking about this earlier, an early session in the pre-sessions here, and as usual gave a very impressive list of ways to go about digging for side effects, to which is, in his case, is a list of ingenious ways to get the people who are impacted, including the ones who were not targeted, but the ones who were nevertheless impacted, to talk to you and to reveal some of the other things that happen that they don't know but suspect may be part of the implications of introducing this particular drug. So, or in our case, much more than just drugs. So those are good ways, but we do have some other ways, one of which is, of course, the really serious devotion of part of the list search to the search for possible side effects. In the literature search, looking at the interventions that have been made that are like the one we're looking at now, we will find clues to side effects that we will have to check out in the particular case we're dealing with. That's a good source to start off with. And of course, the sources that Michael is suggesting are vital and frequently the most fruitful. The unskilled observers. Then there's the skilled observers that we put in to watch for this. And in the case of my little variation on that, the use of goal-free observers who are not aware what the targeted population was or the targeted impacts were, and simply observe the recipients of the intervention to see what is happening in their lives that's different from what is happening in a comparison group life or in their prior lives, wherever we can get some basis for comparison. And then, of course, there is always the possibility that you can do some experimentation on variants of the present model, present intervention model, and see what you get, how much you lose and how much you gain. In the process of doing that, you will often find a change which is in fact an unintended change, but a very important one in terms of its ethical or practical significance. So it's important to understand from the beginning that what I'm beginning to talk about now, pushing harder into the ethical area when doing evaluation and undertaking the full complement of your obligations when you undertake to look at the consequences of an intervention, that, of course, must be taken to cover and must be designed to find the side effects, not just the direct intended effects. Well, now I want to talk about a little more detail about what I'm this step 2 area. Supposing that you are engaged in evaluating the medical resources available in a barrio or a ghetto in a big city somewhere near where you normally reside. You're looking here at having to combine a needs assessment with a design and suggestion and recommendation effort, a rather more extensive menu than you sometimes get when you get a client requesting an evaluation. And in the course of doing this, you will, of course, do some kind of survey, hopefully with a fairly substantial amount of face-to-face interviewing involved in it, so that you're not relying on the relatively poor return rate from surveys and so on. And in the course of that, you will undoubtedly find cases of people who want to say that we need this, this, and this, suggesting that they contribute something to the needs assessment, and you have to look very carefully at which of these can be said to be legitimate. Oh, I'm getting the 10-minute sign, and I've only got 40 minutes of work to get through. So the thing you need to watch for at that point is see how I can put it in a way that makes it more manageable. You need to be giving some attention to feasibility as well as wantedness. But you're going to try to look at things that are very strongly felt as wants in order to qualify them as genuine needs if that qualification can be obtained. So this business of distinguishing the wants from the needs is an important part of your interpretation of the results from your interview, focus groups, and surveys. Now, the problem that you run into at this point in this particular case when you're looking at medical services is that you find from your surveys a number of areas where at the moment medical services are not available. These include the more obvious ones involving fairly expensive equipment, which isn't present in the only clinics in the barrios and the ghettos that you can find there already. So the list of equipment that you'll need or would like to have gets longer and longer. But you'll also find requests for, let's take as an example, abortions. Now, what are you going to do with that? Is it a sign of a defect in the services offered, or a morally correct restriction of the services offered? You're going to have to solve the problem of whether abortion is on demand is morally defensible, desirable, or impossible. So in just the course of an ordinary type of evaluation, you find yourself face to face with the deepest and toughest level of moral argumentation. Dispute by well-meaning, well-trained and well-educated people, absolutely contrary in their solution to the moral problem. Now, what we have done is to try to do two things. One, avoid cases like that by not taking them on. That's a popular solution. Then two, to simply pass the buck back to the client. So you submit a conditional report which says, if you favor abortion on demand, then the results are these. If you don't favor abortion on demand, the results are these. We should put in this, this, and this, but not abortion services. On the other hand, you would put it in, since it's rather inexpensive to arrange, you can reasonably afford it in almost any case. Okay, so this is a set of cases where an ordinary type of evaluation task turns out to involve not an easily solved problem of ethics before you can get very far, but a very difficult problem. And that happens time and time again. I mean, with respect to torture when you're reviewing the CIA or NASA or the armed services or the FBI or the local police in Ferguson, Missouri, and so on. So we can't avoid those. Now, what we've been doing is avoid them. And what I'm saying is too late. You got stuck with them when you became an evaluator. And they're in the definition of evaluation. Ethics is a branch of evaluation. No possible way of disputing that. It is the determining of the merit, worth, and significance or significance of various social events, procedures, and attitudes. So you're stuck with it. Now, of course, we've always been handling it the way that experts tend to do, which is to say, that's not my expertise, so I'll either call in somebody who has it, which is the solution the big hospitals have undertaken in the last 20 years. Most of them now have real ethicists on staff whom they call in for these things. However, they're not terribly good ethicists. They include that remarkable group with a double PhD, which I admire immensely, one in ethics and one in medicine, medical fields, or the PhD MD. That's a great beginning, but of course they are not preeminent in the ethical field, and that's what you really need to learn from. All right, so what I'm saying is, by definition of the field you're in, even though your subspecialty is not anything to do with ethics, you're going to crash into it in the course of your normal trafficking around the problems, including the hidden problems of side effects that you get into. And you will have to do better than, say, a conditional answer. If you think this, the answer is this, and if you think that, the answer is different. You're the evaluator. The question of how to think about deep moral problems is something you have to tackle in order to answer the evaluative question you were asked, which is, what should I put into the clinics? What should I put into the restrictions on the treatment of prisoners? And so on. So I think this is something where we can make a case that you have to do it. Now, I'm going to push harder. The third step in the hierarchy is dealing with problems that you haven't yet run into. The hard problems in ethical dispute that you aren't brought into because of having taken on a regular job in evaluation, which forces you to face that hard problem in ethics. I want you to do more. Your civic responsibilities as a citizen have placed upon you the duty to do the following. Where you have relevant skills, you should put some time to civic duty work, which in many cases involves moral problems where your skills as an evaluator can be extremely helpful in contributing to, not totally resolving, the moral problem. You can help us in our community thinking about the moral problem in all sorts of ways. Most obviously, in seeing what facts are really essential that people have for this community, not for the community down the way. We're not solving the world's problems all the time. We may be solving just our community's problems, or perhaps a larger sense of community, some problems of our region within the state or the state. So the third step gets us into that. Now, the fourth step is worse still, folks, in terms of living the easy life. The problem is going to come up because ethics has two sorts of problems, which divide ethics into, am I down to 5? Right. Which divides ethics into its two classic divisions, normative ethics and meta-ethics. Normative ethics is ethics about the morally disputed issues like abortion and torture and war and so on. And the meta-ethical problem, often said to be the ethical problem, often said to be the key problem in ethics, is the problem of why should I be ethical? Why are we going to all this effort to solve the problems of ethics if in fact there isn't a good reason for me to go out of my way to be ethical? And that's a tough one, and it's been fooling around the philosopher's neck of the woods since Aristotle and Plato and before, and it has been part of every religion one way or another, with or without theistic underpinning, and in various versions under each of those subheadings. And the question is, can we make any contribution to that? And the answer is yes, we can. We can. I will not have time to set out the details on that, but I will say this. By combining the insights on that problem that have been fought out and finally discussed by the profession of ethicists themselves, people in philosophy specializing in ethics and ethical theory, by combining some of those with others of those, and with the kind of routine procedures that the good evaluator uses, we can make considerable progress. The procedure that I think provides a good answer, which is something you can't say about many of them, is that you combine game theory with psychology of attitude control, which since the recent work on addiction has become something much more manageable than it ever was before. And the game theory part of this is relatively simple game theory, and it's not very disputable. It shows that the strategy pays off. The strategy of altruism pays off greatly better than the strategy of egoism. And by using the attitude control that we now have reasonable ability to manage, we can actually make some progress there. All right, well, that's the challenge, friends and colleagues. We're at a new choice point in our future, and it won't happen overnight that we either get into or that we solve all these problems. But I hope you can see that we've got to start thinking about them more seriously than we have, and that there is a possibility of success. So I'll conclude with one remark. A number of years ago, a student of mine came in to say that he had simply not been able to find a topic for a PhD thesis. Did I have any suggestions? And so I made a number of suggestions. And one of them was, why not start looking at evaluation as it is done in other disciplines? And in particular, of course, start at the top. Start with the grand classical disciplines, the physical sciences, the biological sciences. Well, if we had been arguing the other side of that proposal, it would have been easy to say, just what you're feeling now about my new proposal. You would have said, well, what are we going to do? We're going to tell the physicists how to run physics? Yep, that's what we're going to do. Not because we're expert physicists, but because we're evaluators. And the entire structure of physics could not operate for a day if it wasn't doing evaluation everywhere on every topic, everything. They evaluate everything they deal with. They give a lecture saying that, in fact, science is all about matters of fact, but never about matters of value. Go back to their office and start grading student papers. What do they think that is? So we have a situation in which, without realizing it, the great body of systematic scientific evaluation lies within the sciences doing science. But are they doing it well? The evaluation part. And the student took it on and went and looked, got 16 countries to cooperate with him, and discovered that on a number of point scale, which was 100, the winning country of the 16 got 98%, the one that came second got 48%, and the bottom one got 7% on how they evaluated research funding proposals. And the bottom one, with 7%, was France, which used a system which was quite straightforward. If you knew somebody on the committee, you got funded, and if you didn't, you didn't. We decided that wasn't very valuable in terms of our scoring system, and so it came bottom. The one that was top was New Zealand. The one that was second, England, was in fact the originator of the system that New Zealand had refined, but had itself got sloppier as it repeatedly used this approach until it had deteriorated from its original high place. Okay, well, that was something that was impossible, but it got done. And now we're doing it in many disciplines, and we have people helping us there who aren't professional evaluators, but are smart scientists who are interested in the foundations of their discipline and realize that it's really a serious discovery to find that peer review on which they build so heavily is in fact hardly ever tested. It's done frequently. And when it is done carefully and tested, turns out to have correlation coefficients between equally well qualified review panels of about 0.2. So the whole of that damn structure is built on belief that there's a peer review process which really identifies merit, but it doesn't even pass the test of agreement between its own panels. That was a discovery, and that shows you the way in which we can move into an area that prima facie seems impossible. I encourage you to make that effort with ethics.
Thank you very much. Well, we have time for a few questions. We'll group them. Anybody? Yep.
Protests are also allowable.
You're all stunned, are you?
I converted everybody.
Yep. Ooh.
Microphone's coming.
It's coming.
My name is Rick Davies. I can accept that as individuals, every one of us, evaluators or non-evaluators, have a moral responsibility to make ethical judgments in the situations that we find ourselves in. But what I can't see is the argument for why we should be better at or take more responsibility for making moral judgments as evaluators than someone who's a trained ethicist of the kind that you mentioned.
Okay, can you hear this all right? Yeah. All right. I don't care whether you're more or less capable. You're equipped enough to be able to accept it and have a shot at making a contribution. And that's all it takes. That's what Chris Corin did with looking at the way in which research was funded in the great disciplines in 16 countries. And that's where he turned up things that he could really help suggest improvements. Within 6 months of having submitted his thesis, he was working for Russia, Canada, and Switzerland and New Zealand on their committees at their request, improving the way it was done. We can do that in the areas where we find we can pay off with some innovative suggestions and begin to work towards getting a solution going. See, I want to add just a note to that, since there isn't a rush of questions. The beginning of hope for doing something really worthwhile towards the solution of the great ethical problems is understanding how it is that we deal with values in evaluation, which we mostly don't understand at all. The bottom line of the attack on evaluation that brought it from being one of the most common, practical, commonsensical, highly skilled practices that made us survive, not only survive in this world, but also survive very well as the top species. The bottom line in that is that you can give empirical data that supports logically an evaluative conclusion. The attack said that's logically impossible, so you can't ever have empirical evidence for an ethical conclusion. If you haven't ever got good, everyday, practical, observable, or otherwise evidence for ethical conclusions, you can't ever take them seriously, scientifically. So that was the beginning of the value-free doctrine's 50-year-old reign on the social sciences. Of course, people working in medicine who spent their entire day making recommendations based upon their examination of the patient about what the patient ought to do, like stop smoking or take off weight, would just ignored this nonsense. They went on doing exactly what was said to be completely impossible. People in the social sciences unfortunately listened to the positivists instead of looking at a number of the sciences themselves where they would have found that this was done all the time. Empirical data was used to support ethical conclusions, evaluative conclusions, sometimes ethical conclusions. And that, once one understands how that can work, which we're trying to do with the idea of evaluation-specific methodology, then you can begin to get a grip on the edges of ethical problems of the kind that really are hard to handle. But they're no harder to handle than the problem of giving foundations for physics, which we just handled.
Yeah, one more question, and it'll be the last one.
Tessie Katsambas, what have you done in cases where you have engaged in an evaluation in a system that you discover has very different values and ethics than you?
Right. Yes, this is the, so to speak, fancied up version of passing the buck. That is, you say they're just as much entitled to their values as I am to mine. It's all relative. you just gave away the whole ballgame. Because the minute you say those values are just as good as our values, you've said there is no objectivity about evaluative conclusions. Well, then why are we fooling around with them? Let's just ignore them. They have no basis. But you don't really believe that, so therefore you've got a solution. So you're not a full relativist. And the minute that you do that, you've taken a stand which we will challenge you to support, and you have to be able to support it in order to have avoided relativism. But that's part of the business of establishing conclusions. What I do is to tackle the particular case as hard as I can. I mean, I've done a lot of that, 20 countries. And the question isn't hard at all with respect to things like providing food for the hungry and shelter for the homeless. So we can get away with it in the cases if we're careful about picking those. And equity is one stage up from that, a huge stage, a step up, and very important to do it. But it's not as tough as it gets. When you get up to things like abortion, justification of torture, and so on, then you get into an area where you've got to make real progress with the fundamental moral problem before you can really give an answer.
Well, I'll take one more, then just one more. Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Michael. My name is Justin Jagosh from the University of Liverpool. The question is sort of continuing, I think, from what you're saying, but just wondering what you think about this idea. Is it the case that the development of an ethical orientation in evaluation has to do with promoting a version of evaluative science which promotes the inclusion of one's subjective bias in one's evaluation process versus promoting a version of evaluation science which tries to eliminate bias or hide bias in evaluation process?
No, I didn't get that.
You didn't hear it, or do you want me to clarify what I said?
Yes, please.
Basically, I wanted to know if developing ethics in evaluation has to do with promoting subjectivity, one's not necessarily personal, but one's inclusion of one's biases in evaluation versus objectivity in evaluation, which is more about controlling bias or somehow limiting bias.
I'm still not clear enough about where it is that you're raising the question. Is objectivity in evaluation a personal? What's the connection with personal?
Well, I just think that I'm just wondering if one is to be ethical in evaluation, it's about writing in one's orientation, one's views, one's belief, one's values, versus not involving that at all.
Well, the question is, what justification do you have for your personal values? I mean, that's the first problem you've got to face. I mean, unless you've got a justification for your own values, then they are simply one of a pile of values of the people that are involved in this issue. You have no status just because you happen to be the evaluator. That doesn't mean anything. The question is, can you support the values you wish to bring to bear on this problem, which is not your problem, but it's somebody else's problem, and you're trying to solve it. The question is, you can bring in your personal values if you've got a proof which is in common currency, have you got evidence for your values that is bulletproof? If you don't, you're not entitled to bring them in with any weighting at all. It's a very tough requirement, but there is no alternative. The early stab at this in evaluation was the idea that you just say, well, everybody's got a set of values and we have to treat them all equitably. Well, hell, I mean, there goes the whole reason for bothering with them was that they are not just one of a heap of different contradictory values, but that you think there might be one that's right. I mean, this in the written version of this, you'll see this all spelled out, but I break a rule of simplification in order to get a kind of simplification here that's important. I say it is only necessary to have a single moral principle. That principle is altruism. That is, that all people have equal rights prima facie. Now, on top of that, you add modifiers of various kinds, resources, family first, neighbors next, and so on. All of these have very good reasons for them. I mean, common reasons. Now, that's ethics, as it's in every large ethical system that we've ever had on the face of this earth. That is a large piece. I'm adding a piece of analysis, which is all you need to get the rest of an ethical system with that single axiom is empirical data. So if you've got something which says thou shalt not steal, that's justified on the grounds of prima facie equal rights to the owning of property and a justification for the owning of property. And the anarchists, of course, said that part of the justification fails. Well, I think that those arguments haven't proved to be persuasive. But so we've got the way in which we establish the secondary principles in each of these different ethical systems. But the primary principle in each of them is the same. It is the principle of prima facie equal rights. And there is no exception to that. I mean, we have it in every system from the most primitive to the most sophisticated. The Buddha, is not wanted to stress on his deathbed when people came around and said, what can we do in the way of putting up a statue to you that would really reflect your primacy and spirituality and so on? He said, you could have listened to what I spent my life talking about, which was, don't do that sort of thing.
Well, you can see that lots of food for thought. I can see that the audience is start realizing now why this talk is called The Last Frontier. There's a lot to explore in what Michael has said. So please join me in thanking Michael Scriven.